Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleague, dear guest to our high-level panel, it is now my honor to open this next event, a high-level panel, an interactive debate with you, colleagues, on upholding democratic security in Europe. The notion of democratic security is not new. It was first endorsed by the heads of state and government of the Council of Europe at the 1993 Vienna summit, but it is as relevant as it was then as it is today. It has severely been damaged by the Russian aggression against Ukraine. A blatant violation of international law is a direct and real threat to peace and stability on our continent. It has severely damaged the existing mechanisms of multilateral cooperation. It puts at risk the lives and well-being of millions of European citizens, first and foremost the Ukrainians, with whom we stand in solidarity here today. But it also does affect hundreds of millions of European citizens who are not directly touched by the war, including those in the Russian Federation, but also in Belarus, who oppose the war and strive to uphold democracy and fundamental rights against authoritarian and undemocratic governments. With them, we stand in solidarity today as well. The Council of Europe, as you know, is not in charge of hard security. Its role in addressing the consequences of the war of aggression, which is waging on the continent, is nevertheless very important. Because sustainable peace cannot be built without respect for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. That is what democratic security is about. In this morning's debate, we debated ways of promoting democratic resilience of our societies and rejuvenating the functioning of democracy. To enrich our debate further, we now invite our distinguished speakers to share with us their vision on upholding democratic security in Europe on the basis of their comprehensive political experience and insight into multilateral diplomacy. Now, first on my list is His Excellency Mr. Simon Coveney, the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Defence of Ireland and current President of the Committee of Ministers. Mr. Coveney, we are very thankful for the commitment of your country towards a renewed, improved and reinforced Council of Europe. In times of crisis, as we spoke about this morning, leadership is key. And you, Mr. Minister, you do now lead our Committee of Ministers. So we are very eager to get first your statement on behalf of the Presidency, and then we will have our panel with Madam Tsikhanouskaya from Belarus, with the Minister of Foreign Affairs from Finland, and with our own Secretary General. But first, Mr. Minister, I invite you to make your opening remarks.
Thank you, President Cox, and I'm honoured to be speaking with a distinguished panel, with Sviatlana, with Pekka, and also with Marija, of course. This week, 59 years ago, another president addressed our Parliament in Dublin. John F. Kennedy spoke of our nation's values, our commitment to human rights and multilateralism, democracy, and the rule of law. He observed that while Ireland pursues an independent course in foreign policy, it's not neutral between liberty and tyranny, and never will be. That was true then, and it's true now. Ireland has been unequivocal in our support for Ukraine's liberty and our condemnation of the Kremlin's tyranny. 50 years after our own accession to the European community, we firmly endorse Ukraine's candidate status for EU membership, because we recognise the people of Ukraine are doing more than defending their state's territorial integrity, vital as it is, but they're protecting the values Kennedy spoke to, reminding us at once how fragile our freedoms continue to be and how precious they are. In my few words this morning, I want to touch on three factors I consider critical to securing democracy on our continent today. Firstly, how we protect the integrity of our public institutions. Secondly, how we promote the prosperity of our citizens. And thirdly, how we understand the demos in democracy, how we understand our people better, their psychology, and what motivates them in the political choices that they make. First, our institutions. We must be clear in what we strive to protect. Democracy demands more than majority rule. It is a three-legged stool, if you like. To stand, it needs not only free elections, but adherence to an impartial rule of law and a respect for human rights. Understood this way, illiberal democracy is a contradiction in terms. An illiberal politician may be a majoritarian, but they cannot be a democrat. Securing democracy demands that we protect the tapestry of institutions that collectively hold states and all of us to account. It means safeguarding freedom of expression, association, and assembly. It means promoting independent, impartial, and an efficient judiciary. It means guaranteeing the absolute integrity of our electoral systems. Democracy is a precious metal, but it tarnishes easily. Without a press freedom, without vibrant civil society, without independent courts, democracy corrodes. And we've seen the consequences when that happens. And over time, gradually, then suddenly, can collapse into autocracy. If we're to avoid this trend, as democratically elected leaders, we must recommit to the first principles of the Council of Europe. That is why, in the wake of war on our continent, I believe it's time to convene a fourth summit of Council leaders. Why Ireland has made support for the Council's core institutions, above all the European Court of Human Rights, the first priority of our presidency in the months ahead. And why I welcome and hope to see implemented so many of the recommendations from Senator Bogdan Kliš's excellent report on recent challenges to security in Europe, including his proposal to establish a democratic resilience initiative. One of democracy's great virtues is its inherent capacity for self-correction. In the long run, this unique mechanism means democracies are better placed to deliver stability and prosperity for all of our citizens. But as Keynes put it, in the long run, we are all dead. If democracies are to thrive today, we need to convince citizens, young people in particular, of our capacity to deliver over short time horizons, as well as planning for the long term. Key to that is improving the quality of governance, public services, and decisions taken in the exercise of public authority. How do we do this? There are many steps. One is to listen more directly to our citizens and, above all, our younger generations. More than that, to make them heard and to empower them. Ireland's experimentation with citizens' assemblies over the past decade has been a hugely positive experience for us in that respect. While far from a panacea, for us at least, it has proved a way of deepening democratic engagement, bolstering trust, and improving public policy more generally. Collectively, I believe, we need to learn from such experiences and share them widely. Equally and finally, we must strive to better understand the essence of democracy, the demos, or the people that we represent. Here in Strasbourg, human rights and the rule of law are concrete terms. But for most of the Council of Europe's 675 million citizens, they're somewhat abstract. If we're to convince a new generation of their value, we need to communicate them differently. Through a decade and a half of democratic decline, autocrats have understood this well and acted on it, both at home and abroad, communicating concretely, shaping stories, sometimes completely false, promising simple solutions to complex problems, appealing to emotions, most often to, most powerfully, fear, but also our desire for connection, self-worth, and identity. Much of this might be dismissed as disinformation by us. And certainly we need new and better tools to counter untruths, above all on digital platforms. But we must also understand why those appeals do resonate to increasing numbers of people, and draw lessons when we come to make the case for inclusive, diverse democracies. Because we will not defeat falsehoods with fact-checking alone. We need to counter them with positive and compelling narratives of our own. Populists and autocrats have no real vision for the future. Their defining narratives are rooted in an imagined, often imperialist past. In such hands, history can be a terrible weapon. A year ago, we read Vladimir Putin's long essay on Russia and its ties to Ukraine. His version of history was false, but for him it provided a pretext for invasion. It falls to us as Democrats to counter such false histories. But we must also celebrate great truths. So let me finish now, not with history, but with her story. All here know the bravery of Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, sorry Sviatlana, leader of democratic Belarus. What some of you may not know is her connection to my country, to Ireland. As a young man, before I entered politics, I helped raise funds in support of a charity called the Chernobyl Children's Project, which has come to be the single largest contributor to try to respond to the consequences of that Chernobyl disaster. Sviatlana, in some ways in Ireland, is known as a Chernobyl child. One of those thousands of children who come to Ireland for respite in the wake of disaster. She was hosted in a small Tipperary town, for those of you who know Ireland, called Roscrea, by the Dean family, Marion and Henry, and returned to them summer after summer, in time helping to mentor other children, many of them traumatized. One of the qualities we value most in Ireland is hospitality. Indeed, one of our 3 presidency priorities, to foster a Europe of inclusion and diversity, is framed in the title Fáilte, a word that Sviatlana knows very well, which means welcome in Irish. Her story reflects some of what makes our democracies great: the capacity for empathy, connection, kindness, values shared across many miles that separate Minsk from Tipperary, or for that matter, Cork to Kyiv. And that carry over ages. Democracy is never a final achievement, President Kennedy once said. It is a call to untiring effort. So let us never forget, and let us better explain what makes this effort so very worthwhile, particularly in the context of the continent that we need to protect today, a continent at war, a continent that has seen 6 million refugees having to travel because of war and violence and brutality and aggression into other parts of our continent where they're receiving hospitality and protection. This institution needs to rise to the occasion, in my view, in terms of the responsibilities that we have to protect democracy, to protect the rule of law, and to protect human rights in the context of the history that is unfolding in our time. So I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, and I think that I can speak on behalf of the Assembly that we are very happy that we are in the next months in your hands under your leadership on the Irish Presidency of the Council of Europe. And thank you very much for your introductory remarks. Now we will have 3 keynote speakers on the issue, and our first speaker is not a head of state, is not a minister. Normally this assembly is addressed by heads of states and ministers, but what does not exist now could happen in the future. Her name was already mentioned by the minister, and her name has been mentioned often in this hemicycle, although it is a quite difficult name for many of us to pronounce, Sviatlana. But nevertheless, we are most eager to listen to the leader of the Belarusian opposition, whose name has been mentioned in reports, in discussions, and who will now address us. Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, you have the floor, madam.
Dear President Cox, Secretary General Burić, Minister Coveney, Minister Haavisto, honorable members of the Assembly. Today, we speak about Senator Klich's report on the role of the Council of Europe. It made me think of the man who first publicly proposed the creation of this organization to unite Europeans around their democratic values, Sir Winston Churchill. A few days ago, I watched his address given in Zurich not long after the Second World War. In his speech, Churchill spoke of the tragedy of Europe, how our noble continent, despite all its remarkable achievements, was unable to avoid a series of horrible, destructive wars. But it was not a speech of despair. Rather, Churchill spoke of hope, that former aggressors and victims could become a new European family, united in peace, freedom, and prosperity. That tragedy could be transformed into promise through values-based cooperation in international organizations, like the one I'm addressing today. Nearly 80 years later, we see how right he was. Yet, despite this remarkable progress, the tragedy of Europe is not yet over. The fires of war burn again in our continent. And again, voices are heard urging us to appease rather than oppose behavior that is the antithesis of everything this organization stands for. Ladies and gentlemen, we must once and for all end the tragedy of Europe. In Belarus, it is unjust imprisonment, torture, and the death penalty, dictatorship and censorship, corruption and theft of our national resources, the sale of our sovereignty to maintain power, hijacking of the international flight to seize active citizens, abuse of migrants to create chaos on our borders, and the use of our country as a launching pad to attack and threaten our neighbors. This is not what we Belarusians want for our country and for Europe. Our victory in the 2020 election was a message loud and clear. We are Europeans, and we want our country back. Back to Belarusians and back to Europe. Last year, my address at the European Parliament here in Strasbourg was a warning that the tragedy of Belarus will become a new tragedy of Europe if it's not met with a determined, principled, and practical response. In light of events since then, I was right. This message has only become more urgent. Will the tragedy of Europe continue because good governments give up on their values and fail to act in time? Ukrainians haven't given up on those values, and they have shown the courage to act. They know that an attack on their sovereignty is an attack on the sovereignty of all. They know that giving the bear a bite only whets its appetite. Ukrainians continue to fight and believe as the tragedy of Europe continues. We Belarusians haven't given up on those values either. Our people continue to resist even after widespread crackdowns in the last 2 years. Some 2,000 people have been detained for protesting the war on Ukraine. More than 80 acts of sabotage against the Russian military have been carried out by our partisans inside Belarus. And up to 1,500 Belarusian volunteers have joined the Ukrainian army. And one of them is Timur Mickiewicz. He was 17 years old when police beat him unconscious in the first days of our peaceful protests in 2020. He was in coma for a week. His mother died of stress. Our people helped Timur to flee to Czechia, where doctors got him back on his feet. And this spring, he went to defend Ukraine. Timur understands that the threat Ukraine faces today is bigger than a threat to just one country. That the fight in Ukraine is a fight for your freedom and ours. Timur, like many Belarusians, continues to fight and to hope as the tragedy of Europe continues. If the aggressors are allowed to prevail, prospects for freedom and security in Europe will diminish substantially. An emboldened empire with more than a foot inside Europe's door. New threats across the region, new resources to manipulate. If, however, the current threat is contained, if we become together to demonstrate that respect for freedom and human rights are the basis for peace and prosperity, we may yet overcome the tragedy of Europe. In order for that to happen, we must sanction the aggressors that threaten us. At the same time, we must extend a hand of friendship and support to the people of those countries. This is an important distinction. The regime that do wrong should be punished. At the same time, ordinary people who do right should be encouraged. Encouraged because one simple fact: we belong to Europe. Dear ladies and gentlemen, we need to have more Council of Europe in the lives of Belarusians and more Belarus in the Council of Europe. This cooperation should be built along two major avenues: institutional building and society development. And I'm asking today the Council of Europe to establish a steering committee on the relations with Belarus. It should be composed of the various bodies of the Council of Europe and the representatives of the democratic forces and civil society of Belarus. This group would jointly determine the priority areas of cooperation. It will conceive, prepare, and launch assistance programs and projects and oversee their implementation. This is one, but a very concrete and practical step. And it is also my simple answer to today's question of the discussion on what is the role of the Council of Europe. The role of the Council of Europe is to bring Belarus closer already now. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the history of our continent to show us the way. Our values are our strength. And today we must use every bit of our strength to defend those values for the sake of all Europe. We have the power to end the tragedy of Europe once and for all. and to hold out the promise of Europe to all who aspire to live together in freedom, peace and prosperity. So let us do it. Thank you. Живе Беларусь! Слава Україні! And long live Europe!
Before starting, Sviatlana was asking other people in the room. You have seen there are people in the room. They listened very carefully to your first address in this esteemed hemicycle. You said we want to have more Council of Europe in Belarus and we need more Belarus in the Council of Europe. You made a concrete proposal, but you also had your first address here and you have seen and listen to the applause. I think it has been appreciated very much. Thank you very much for your contribution. Now we are going to listen to a representative of a country that often is seen as lying somewhere in the north, far away from everything, the most happy people on earth, but for the rest you do not hear much about it. But now it is in the heart of Europe because it lies very close to the member state that we had to exclude here. It shares an enormous border, and it's also involved in how to find its way in international organizations, in international cooperation. It has a long-standing experience in dealing with difficult questions, and therefore I'm most happy that I now can ask to come to the rostrum the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Pekka Haavisto from Finland. You have the floor, Pekka.
Mr. President of the Parliamentary Assembly, President of the Committee of Ministers, Secretary General of the Council of Europe, Madam Tsikhanouskaya, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to be here today at this timely event to explore common ways to uphold democratic security in Europe. And particularly when I was walking to this building in the morning, I remember that I have been here 33 years ago, 1989, when Finland was not a member of Council of Europe. We were part of the parliamentary delegation from Finland to explore what is this organization about, and when we returned home, we made a recommendation that Finland should be member of Council of Europe, and that happened. First of all, Russia's aggression against Ukraine has profoundly shaken everyone's sense of security. First, we have to focus on supporting and helping Ukraine, not least on the issue of accountability. In the longer run, we must continue strengthening democratic security for all in Europe. We must ensure that the Council of Europe remains the benchmark for human rights, democracy and the rule of law in Europe. It's a strong defender of our democracies, our institutions and courts, and indeed the free voices of our citizens. We want a strong organization that can protect its core values, as it clearly has done this spring. The ability to vote and to take majority decisions is an advantage of our organization. At the same time, we need to make use of the lessons learned and end democratic backsliding in Europe. The major neglect of human rights, democracy and the rule of law in Russia was a precursor to the war against Ukraine, the lack of press freedom, the banning of NGOs, foreign agents' laws, disregard of judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, etc. The list is unfortunately long. Therefore, considering the new reality in many parts of Europe, with increasing populism and nationalism, disregard of minority rights, more hate speech and deliberate weakening at once independent institutions, we need to return to the core values of the Council of Europe and review the priorities of the organization as we agreed in Turin. This requires more openness and transparency. Secondly, for Finland, enhancing the participation of civil society and national human rights institutions in the work of the Council of Europe, as well as protecting human rights defenders, is a priority. Civil society and national human rights institutions are already actively consulted in standard setting, but they should also be involved in the shaping of the future of the organization. The Committee of Ministers need to open up more and exchange views with a broad variety of stakeholders. I thank Foreign Minister Coveney and the Irish Presidency for their many efforts on more transparency. At least some of these exchanges must be made public in the spirit of the 2019 Helsinki decisions on civil society. Excellencies, dear colleagues, civil society and human rights defenders in Belarus and beyond need our support. In Belarus, the regime has liquidated over 300 NGOs. More than 1,200 people are currently political prisoners, including many minors. These people should be released immediately and without preconditions. In Turin, several colleagues stressed that the Council of Europe needs to work with civil society. As the General Secretary, Madam Burić, stated, we need to empower those who do not agree with the brutal politics of aggression practiced by their political leaders. This is exactly what the Council of Europe and its member states need to do now. We are at the historic junction where support to democratic forces is in high demand. We have to be innovative to find ways to support civil society, human rights defenders and free media in Belarus, and quite separately also in Russia. This can be done through dialogue and tools that we have available and tools that are yet to be created. I would like to turn to Madam Tsikhanouskaya to say that opposition groups and parties are equally worthy of support. The Council of Europe can have a role in demonstrating concrete support to opposition groups that are working for democracy and human rights. Democracy needs people who work relentlessly to counter the actions of authoritarian leaders. You are one of those courageous persons. My hope is that all European countries could become members of the Council of Europe, but there are two overall preconditions for this. First, they respect the statute of the organization, and secondly, they respect its core values. This can never be compromised. Finally, Excellencies and colleagues, the Council of Europe can be one of the guarantors of democratic security in Europe. We should respect and use the tools it offers in order to give the organization a chance to help us uphold our commitments. Monitoring activities could be further developed so that we can make sure that commonly agreed standards are met. A strong Council of Europe is needed to ensure human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, and to prevent future wars and conflicts. These values must be the building blocks of our common European future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, for your wise words. And the last keynote speaker does not need an introduction because we ourselves have elected her to be our Secretary General. So I now give the floor to Marija Pejčinović Burić, our Secretary General of the Council of Europe. Marija.
Monsieur le Président de l'Assemblée parlementaire, Monsieur le Président du Comité des ministres, Monsieur le Ministre, Madame la leader de l'opposition bélarusse, Mesdames et Messieurs les parlementaires, Mesdames et Messieurs. Le Conseil de l'Europe a été créé il y a 73 ans, à la suite de deux guerres mondiales dévastatrices et sur une promesse de paix. Comme l'affirme notre statut, cela passe par une plus grande union entre nos États membres. Au fil des ans, nous avons travaillé à renforcer cette union au moyen de normes communes relatives aux droits de l'homme, à la démocratie, à l'état de droit. Ainsi, la coopération a bien souvent remplacé les conflits, permettant à nos populations de bénéficier de la sécurité démocratique à laquelle elles ont droit. Cette approche a eu des effets considérables et positifs. Notre organisation est passée de 10 États membres en 1949 à 46 aujourd'hui. Nous nous sommes dotés d'une Convention européenne des droits de l'homme que tous les États ont ratifiée. Cette convention est interprétée par une Cour dont les arrêts sont contraignants. Nous avons produit 223 instruments juridiques qui continuent d'améliorer nos vies, tout comme chacun des arrêts de la Cour. Toutes les parties du Conseil de l'Europe, notamment l'Assemblée parlementaire, le Congrès et le Bureau de la Commissaire aux droits de l'homme, jouent un rôle spécifique pour promouvoir nos buts communs. Ce que nous avons réalisé ainsi n'a d'équivalent sur aucun autre continent. Mais cet édifice est soumis à de fortes pressions. La montée des extrémismes populistes et nationalistes est une menace directe pour nos valeurs, pour le multilatéralisme et pour la sécurité démocratique. L'exemple le plus manifeste en est bien sûr l'agression brutale commise par la Fédération de Russie contre l'Ukraine, qui est l'un de nos États membres. Le mois dernier, à l'occasion de la Journée de l'Europe, je me suis rendue personnellement en Ukraine afin de montrer clairement où se joue son présent et son avenir. Et pour constater par moi-même les ravages de la violence dans le pays. Je n'oublierai jamais ce que m'ont rapporté le président Zelensky et de nombreux autres Ukrainiens, dont le courage n'a d'égal que leur attachement envers leur pays et leur foi dans son avenir démocratique et européen. Pas plus que je n'oublierai ce que j'ai vu à Borodianka et à Irpin. Les souffrances endurées confirment que la décision d'exclure la Russie du Conseil de l'Europe était la bonne. Toutes les parties de notre organisation l'ont soutenue, tout comme nous sommes maintenant tous unis aux côtés de l'Ukraine. C'est pourquoi nous avons pris la décision de rouvrir notre bureau de Kiev, d'apporter notre concours au bureau de la procureure générale pour les enquêtes sur les violations flagrantes des droits de l'homme et adapter notre plan d'action pour l'Ukraine à la lumière des réalités sur le terrain. Lors de la session ministérielle de Turin, le mois dernier, les États membres ont approuvé ces ajustements. Ils ont aussi indiqué clairement que le Conseil de l'Europe ferait usage de tous ces instruments pour que la Fédération de Russie rende compte de toutes les violations des droits de l'homme commises. This is the right approach. Upholding the principles of democratic security requires political will. The determination to support Europeans who believe in our values and those who are deprived of them in practice. So I was pleased also that the ministers who gathered in Turin reaffirmed that civil society plays a vital role in achieving this organization's aims. This is true also for the Russian Federation and for Belarus, where national leaders have spurned them. Mrs. Tsikhanouskaya, you have spoken again today with clarity, courage, and conviction about the situation in your country. And moving forward, we will find the best ways in which to engage with the opposition in exile and the range of civil society voices that still exist among Belarusians despite the pressure that they endure. This was discussed last week at our rapporteur group on democracy, again here today. And I know that you will soon appear in front of our Committee of Ministers, as we all consider the most effective way forward in line with our mandate as an intergovernmental organization. It is a tragedy that the Russian Federation has broken with modern Europe. and that Belarus has closed its eyes to a European perspective, despite this organization's long-held hope, confirmed at our 2005 Warsaw Summit, that the country would reform and take its place in our European family. Clearly, that moment is not now. But the long-term goal of democratic security on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, uniting all parts of our continent, must and will remain. But in seeking this future, we must ask ourselves whether we are well equipped as possible to achieve it, whether we have the right approach to these fast-changing times. So I welcome Member States' request to set up a high-level reflection group to consider our response to the new realities and challenges on our continent. I have already selected 7 members of the high standing, and the group will start its work next week. But I'm also of the view that we need all of our member states to come together and decide on the future role of this organization, to agree on how we best fit in the newly shaped geopolitical architecture of Europe. That is why I believe that the time has come for a 4th summit of our heads of state and government. This could happen as early as November. And the clarity and unity it should deliver could put democratic security on a firmer footing for the years to come. Dear friends, there are learned people who argue that we are in a twilight of democracy. I do not agree. That the fading of the light in Europe is not inevitable. In 1949, this organization was established to illuminate a better way forward, a bright and just future for all. Since then, we have benefited so much from human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Let us now work together in these hard times so that future generations benefit further still. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does it function? Thank you very much, Madam Secretary General, for your inspiring words. We now have listened to you. You now are going to listen. We are now going to listen to the members of the Assembly, because we are in a Parliamentary Assembly and people have made it clear that they want to make their remarks and comments, and they are going to do that, and they are going to show that in 1 minute you can say a lot. And the first one who is going to prove that you can say a lot in 1 minute is Mr. Frank Schwabe, representing the group of the Socialists, Democrats and Greens. Frank, you have the floor for 1 minute.
Dear Mr. President, dear Ministers, dear Secretary General, dear Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, and I think we have no doubts if in Belarus, Belarus would deal with the values like we understand it, you would be the elected president of Belarus. So thank you very much that you are accepting our invitation, and thank you very much that we share common values and some common aims for Europe. And we express this in a report in April we decide here in this assembly. And we agree the best would be that if we would have everywhere in Europe democratic governments who respect our values. But since this is not the case, and this is for sure not the case in Belarus, we have to find another space for those who are committed to our values in the countries, coming from the countries, and at the end respecting and loving our values. And so, Mrs. Tsikhanouskaya, you make a proposal of a steering committee, and I would like to say in the name of the group of the Socialists, Democrats and Greens, we agree that we need common approach, a common work together to see how we can create such spaces, opportunities and connections between us.
Thank you very much, Frank. And the next minute will be for Alexander Pejčinović, the chairperson of the EPP CD group. Alex, you have the floor.
Chers collègues, Madame Tsikhanouskaya, président du groupe PP polonais, je suis très heureux, chère Sviatlana, de vous accueillir dans cette assemblée, dans cette maison commune européenne qui a pour vocation de défendre la démocratie et les droits de l'homme sur les continents européens. Je rappelle à nos collègues que vous êtes l'une des principales icônes de l'opposition biélorusse au régime de Loukachenko et que votre époux, comme plusieurs centaines de compatriotes, a été lourdement condamné en Biélorussie sous faux prétexte des troubles à l'ordre public. Certains de vous exiliés, contraintes de vous exilier en Lituanie, vous incarnez désormais le visage de l'opposition biélorusse et vous êtes les signes que la majorité du peuple de Biélorusse n'a rien à voir avec son régime. Nous serions très heureux de vous entendre, chère Sviatlana, sur la situation actuelle en Biélorussie et les conséquences de la guerre menée par la Russie contre l'Ukraine. Pour plus que 30 ans des années, trois peuples ont été ensemble dans la même République. Ainsi, je vais terminer par trois vocations. Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła, żyje Białoruś, szczęście wmerła Ukraina. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Alex. The next minute goes to Zsolt Nemet, who represents the group of the European Conservatives.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We have been discussing the European future in the past 1 hour. Two historical Yeah, it now seems to work. Okay. So two historical decisions are in the pipeline this week at the European Summit. Ukraine and Moldova are going to get the European candidate status. But unfortunately, there is a thorn in this rose. Georgia, a country which was the first victim of the Russian aggression, remains deprived of this candidate status. Dear European ministers, two of you are here. What a mistake. This is a surprising and unacceptable discrimination by the Commission in my reading. May I ask you, both of you, can Georgia hope for your support in this question? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zsolt. Now we are going to listen to the new president of the group of Liberals and Democrats in Europe, Mr. Julian Bulai. Julian, your minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear members of the panel, dear Ms. Tsikhanouskaya, welcome to PACE. We are very happy to have you here in the hemicycle. Dear Ms. Tsikhanouskaya, your presence here is an explicit sign of support of this Assembly to the democratic efforts of the Belarusian civil society. 2 years ago, Belarusian people massively protested against injustice and dictatorship. Today, many are in prison. We are proud to count you, Ms. Tsikhanouskaya, among the European democratic community. The place of strong civil society fighting dictatorship and defending democratic values belongs to this Assembly. We now live in a new political context. Totalitarian regimes are back to Europe and it threatens our security. Dear colleagues, dear President of PACE, dear Secretary General, if we want to be relevant in this new context, we should think of new institutional ways to include into the work of our organization the democratic forces of Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian. And now the last speaker on behalf of the political groups is Madam Nina Kasimati. She speaks on behalf of the United European Left. Nina, you have the floor.
It has been, dear learned friends, it has been said in manifold cases by willing observers that Turkey is an important player in the Ukraine crisis. Yet, it is by no means a predictable one or a principled one. In fact, Ankara, the evasive neutral, is known for taking arduously advantage of instability in order to promote its own interests. It is regrettable that Turkey insists on its illegal and provocative practices. Only recently, they have put forth in a most formal way unfounded claims that Greece's sovereignty on its eastern Aegean islands depends on their demilitarization. In their letters to the United Nations Secretary General, they openly question Greece's sovereignty over all the islands facing the Turkish coast, from Samothraki to Castellorizo. The absurdity of this proposition has been signaled by the international community in a most unambiguous way. We would appreciate if key international actors, such as the Council of Europe, take action on this matter to give true meaning to the notion of upholding democratic security, as well as security in its own soil. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina. Prochain orateur est Monsieur Alain Milon de la France. Alain?
Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Ministre, Madame Tsikhanouskaya, mes chers collègues, en janvier dernier, des milliers de migrants irakiens ont été amenés en Biélorussie dans le but de les inciter à entrer illégalement en Pologne, en Lituanie et en Lettonie. Cette utilisation de migrants comme arme à des fins de déstabilisation des États voisins est profondément révoltante. Madame Tsikhanouskaya, vous incarnez l'espoir pour de nombreux Biélorusses opprimés par le régime d'Alexandre Loukachenko. La Biélorussie n'est pas membre du Conseil de l'Europe. Qu'attendez-vous de notre organisation aujourd'hui? Comment pouvons-nous aider la société civile biélorusse, mais aussi demain la société civile russe, que nous n'oublions pas après le départ de la Russie du Conseil de l'Europe?
Merci beaucoup, Alain. The next speaker is Kimmo Kiljunen from Finland. Kimmo, 1 minute for you.
Mr. President, I'm more than pleased to see the leader of the democratic Belarus, Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, here with us today. We have obviously followed very, very carefully the development in your country, in particularly after the 2020 presidential elections and the huge demonstrations throughout the Belarus, people demanding democratization. They expressed the will of the people very, very, very clearly. We have understood that the basic principles in your efforts for democratization is, first of all, the transformation must be peaceful. Secondly, without no foreign intervention. And obviously, thirdly, to be based on dialogue. Madam Tsikhanouskaya, I would like to ask you, do you still share those views? And secondly, I want to note that we took a very clear note what you said concerning how to strengthen the efforts of Council of Europe to support the democratization in your country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kimmo. And now I call Madam Fiona O'Loughlin from Ireland. Fiona?
Mr. President, and thank you to our distinguished panel for your strong commitments to democracy and, of course, for your inspirational words. In this chamber, we come across very many important challenges and issues, and they always feature highly on our agenda, but I think today's debate is the most important one. And we always have to remember that alone we cannot fix the challenges, but we have the power of the collective. Minister Coveney spoke about the meaning of fáilte. Well, I'm going to give another few Irish words, Níneartha Cur le Chéile, and that means that we are really, really strong together, and we have to stand together in the face of tyranny and aggression. When we look at the key pillars of democratic security, every single one of them has been attacked since February the 24th. We also have to ensure that our values endure and our standards and commitment to ensuring the rule of law and democracy must also. It's interesting that John F. Kennedy spoke almost 60 years ago about Ireland not being neutral between liberty and tyranny. And while we value our military neutrality, I have to say that we have a proud record in peacekeeping, and our colleagues here from Ukraine and indeed from Belarus have no doubt that we stand with them. Slava Ukrainia.
Thank you, Fiona. And now I give the floor to Ahmed Yildiz from Turkey. Sorry, Ahmed, I went a bit too fast. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Unfortunately, another Greek member misused her position as Speaker of a political group to baselessly accuse Turkey. If she is curious about Turkish contribution and help to Ukraine, she can ask, she can get information from Ukraine negotiators and Ukrainian delegation here. Of course, there are many Turkish-Greek disputes to be dealt with negotiations, but one thing is clear: the islands are in demilitarized status by agreements. Then this is it is Turkish right to emphasize it everywhere, and it is my right to do it here. My question is about the topic of panel about terrorism. Terrorism poses threat both to security and democracy. And even it complicates the international relations recently. Unfortunately, the international cooperation on this issue eroded. Even sometimes the states are insensitive and sometimes subcontract their security business to terror organizations. Should our Council of Europe, be in a position to contribute for a new work in the UN to put this on track? Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. Now we are going to listen to Madam Suna Iversdottir from Iceland. Suna?
Mr. President, thank you. Ministers, Madam Tsikhanouskaya, great to see you here, and thank you for this debate. First of all, as the General Rapporteur of this Assembly for the status of human rights defenders, I'd like to say that I've presented or requested that we make a concept note in the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights about how we can strengthen our relationship with civil society in Belarus, but also in Russia, so that we can further collaborate with you. I think that your idea about a steering committee is a good one, and I will help as I can to further that idea. As the rapporteur for political prisoners in Russia, I would also like to say that the weapon of imprisoning people for speaking their minds, and I know that this is also a problem in Belarus, is one of the strongest weapons against democracy. And that is why reports and fights against this kind of scourge on democracy is so important. That's why we must ensure that we keep the names of political prisoners high on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Suna. Now we are going to listen to Madam Isabel Meireles from Portugal. Isabel?
Merci, Monsieur le Président, chers collègues. Le recul de la démocratie en Europe est une menace qui dérive ces jours-là de l'agression non provoquée et injustifiée de la Fédération russe contre l'Ukraine. C'est vrai que les questions de défense pure et dure sont exclues des attributions du Conseil de l'Europe, mais pas la défense de la démocratie. Je dirais même que c'est son core business. Belarus inclus, vous avez notre appui, Madame Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, et merci aussi d'être venue. D'ailleurs, le Conseil de ministres a pour la première fois appliqué très bien à notre avis, l'article 8 du statut en vue de retirer le statut de membre du Conseil de l'Europe à la Russie. Et ici, le Conseil de l'Europe joue un rôle fondamental en soutenir la coopération transfrontalière et d'autres efforts visant à désamorcer les tensions et promouvoir la compréhension au niveau local et de la société civile. Pour finir, la seule question que je pose, c'est si, malgré tout, il est suffisant de demander aux États membres d'allouer plus de ressources financières et personnelles sans avoir un plan très bien défini et structuré et pas seulement des mesures ponctuelles pour la défense de la démocratie européenne. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Merci à vous, Isabel. Now we are going to listen to Mr. Vladimir Vardanian from Armenia. Vladimir. He's not there, so we are now giving the floor to Mr. José María Sánchez García from Spain.
Merci. Oui, Monsieur le ministre des Affaires étrangères de la République d'Irlande a dit que la démocratie n'est pas seulement une question de majorité des voix obtenues dans les élections, mais aussi une question d'indépendance du pouvoir des tribunaux et aussi une question de respect du free speech. Je dois dire que même si on est en train de parler de la Russie, et bien sûr ça nous concerne tous, cette agression de la Fédération russe contre la République d'Ukraine, mais en fait il y a dans des nations de l'Europe, et c'est le cas de l'Espagne, une certaine attaque au pouvoir des juges et de leur indépendance, ce qui a été mis en évidence par la Commission européenne, mais cette initiative ou cet élan du gouvernement contre l'indépendance des juges n'a pas terminé, malheureusement. Et il en est de même pour la question du free speech. Il y a une certaine ambiance et certaines mesures que le gouvernement voulait prendre contre la liberté de communication dans les réseaux sociaux. Et heureusement, cela n'a pas eu de suite, mais il faut être très attentif, penser au fait que le gouvernement espagnol, c'est une coalition où il y a un parti nettement communiste qui a une interprétation de la démocratie tout à fait différente de la démocratie telle qu'elle est entendue par le Conseil de l'Europe. Merci.
Merci à vous. Now we call Mr. Anastasios Chatzivasiliou from Greece. Anastasios.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, we welcome Sviatlana that she always sends a very strong message from Strasbourg in every case. So after the despicable Russian invasion, we should send a strong message that revisionism should not be tolerated, and we have to work about democratic security. So to my opinion, we need a definition for real and imitation democracies. We need a distinction between democracy and autocracy, and it's high time to do that right now. So I believe that we need new instruments that will help us to prevent breaches of our common standards, of our common values. And as I'm coming from Greece, I would like to tell you that Turkish provocations against third countries, against Greece and Cyprus, for example, is not a bilateral issue, as my colleagues from Turkey have said. It's a European issue. It's a matter of democratic security when you claim sovereignty over a third state. So we have to be more precautious. So I would like to ask you, do you agree that we have to move forward to become more resilient, to have new tools and instruments? Otherwise, I'm afraid that an institutional undermining of our organization is coming and it might happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we are going to listen to Madam Salma Zahid from Canada. Salma?
Representatives from democratic countries, we must do our part to promote the institutions we serve and the real value they provide to our fellow citizens. As the concept of democratic security suggests, we should promote democracy not as an end in itself, but as a means of achieving outcomes to which every country strives: harmonious societies, prosperous economies, and effective public institutions. We need this message more than ever. According to Freedom House, the level of democracy has been declining globally for 16 consecutive years. Canada has long supported democratic development around the world, and in 2020-2021, Canada devoted more than $150 million in development assistance to initiatives related to the promotion of democracy. Canada also supports electoral observation, including through the NGO Canada. Promoting democracy is about recognizing the mutual benefit of building strong institutions and engaging in genuine dialogue. And as the Council of Europe has demonstrated, it can make meaningful contributions to all the societies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salma. Now, the last speaker in the debate will be Mr. Alexander Nikolowski, because we need time for our keynote speakers to react. Alexander, you have 1 minute.
Crucial debate, and thank you for opening it for the Parliamentary Assembly, for Council of Europe in this period of war in Europe that nobody expected it would happen in 21st century. I think what we should think a lot is, as it is as well in the headline, upholding the democratic security in Europe, because the democracy is under threat. Populist movements rise all around the continent. They play with the feelings of the people. They play with the economic injustice. If you want, even with that, whether someone is from rural or urban area. And that is something that might hit the democracy, and by that, the stability and security on the continent, which is already under a huge, huge danger. And that's why it's good, the Parliamentary Assembly, to rethink and to discuss about many, as well, of the documents that are core of this Europe that we know about, not about the substance is excellent, but how to make mechanisms that will create an atmosphere for their implementation. Not only the European Charter for Human Rights, but many, many other resolutions that we vote for here. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Alexander. And sorry that I have to interrupt the list of speakers, but I think it is a matter of politeness that we give the floor now to our keynote speakers to react. You performed excellently. In 1 minute you said a lot. Now I invite our keynote speakers to also say a lot, and also a few minutes, because we have about 50 minutes in total. Mr. Minister Coveney, could I first give you the floor? And there are microphones next to you.
Well, first of all, thank you for everybody's comments, and I have to say I'm really pleased to hear just how strong the support is for Sviatlana in particular in terms of the challenges and struggles of Belarus in the context of what we've witnessed in recent years, which Sviatlana itemized, I think, very directly in what she had to say. So I hope that the Parliamentary Assembly will take up the challenge of putting in place a formal structure that can strengthen the relationship between the Belarusian opposition and this Parliamentary Assembly to ensure that we can provide a platform for democratic ambition and truth when it comes to Belarus. I think there's been, in some ways, a difficulty since the enormity of the war in Ukraine. The messages coming out of Belarus have been harder to hear because of the strength of the message and media coverage and extraordinary human suffering that has resulted in Belarus as a result of Russian aggression, or sorry, in Ukraine as a result of Russian aggression. And we cannot and should not allow ourselves to lose focus on the challenge that we face collectively to facilitate the transition, the peaceful transition through dialogue, we hope, to democracy in Belarus also. I mean, there's a lot of commentary here on the need to protect against populism, against autocracy, and to promote human rights. I think, you know, if I'm to comment on that, certainly from my experience politically, if we reduce the number of targets that we're going after, well, then we're more likely to achieve end goals. And what I mean by that is that the Council of Europe, in all of its institutions, has a very specific focus around supporting democracy and protecting citizens' human rights through the rule of law and the implementation of court judgments and, of course, consistency with the Convention. And I think that is where our focus needs to be. And as and when countries, some of whom are members of this organization, move away from those key principles, then I think there's got to be mechanisms that highlight that quickly and show that there is a cost to moving away from the commitments that countries have signed up to. And it's what that cost entails, I think, is what we need to decide over the next 12 months or so, because the war in Ukraine is an extraordinarily significant wake-up call for this organization, in my view, if we are serious about protecting people's human rights and protecting democracy across the continent of Europe, well, then we've got to have mechanisms that provide deterrence to countries moving in a populist, anti-democratic direction. And that's why, in my view, the only way we can do that in a comprehensive way is to get our heads of state to recommit to an infrastructure that's necessary to allow these institutions, its court, its Parliamentary Assembly, its ministers, to actually have effectively a new rule book to operate to in response to the challenges that we face today. So I hope that's a response to what I get as frustrations and anxiety around the capacity for the Council of Europe to do what European citizens needs us to do. And it's our generation of politician that has to make this happen. This is not about history. It's about today and how we learn lessons from the extraordinarily tragic history of our continent. Lessons that I think many of us thought we had learnt until this invasion began on the 24th of February. But as Sviatlana and others remind us, of course, Ukraine and the aggression there is not the only part of this continent that needs the focus of this institution. So thank you for your comments, and I'll have an opportunity to take questions later, perhaps on some of the detail of what I've just referred to.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Now I would like to ask Madam Tsikhanouskaya to react on the many comments that were given in her direction. Sviatlana.
So, first of all, thank you for everyone who said warm words towards Belarusian people and our position at the moment. First of all, one main remark. I ask you stop calling Lukashenko president of Belarus. He is not. He doesn't represent the will of Belarusian people. He lost the election in 2020, and since then, Belarusian people are fighting against him and against dictatorship in our country. Thank you. Second, we still insist that the changes for democracy in Belarus has to be peaceful. And through negotiations, through dialogue, we always insisted on this and sent clear message. And but of course, we have to understand that there are two red lines in any negotiations. First one is that before any dialogue, all the political prisoners have to be released out of prisons because their conditions are awful. People are really suffering. They are isolated there from communication. They are deprived of normality, and they are believing in us. They are believing in you. So without all of them are on the freedom, no context, no negotiations, no dialogue. And the second one, any negotiations should be between regime and democratic forces or Belarusian people, not between regime and Europe, not between regime and Russia, only in this scenario, because Belarusians have to be involved into all processes. We are speaking on behalf of the majority of Belarusians. And how Council of Europe can be helpful in our course. Of course, there are many items to work about. First of all, it's welcome representatives of democratic forces to the different hearings and events. The louder our voice is, the more power as people we have on the international arena. Also help us to prepare a package of reforms, electoral reform, participation of women and youth in democratic governance, local governance reform, because we understand that now we are fighting against the regime, but also we'll have to build new Belarus, and we have to work on this Belarus now to be prepared when the window of opportunities for us comes. We will be ready to build this new country. Also, it's very important to touch the topic of Belarus in the documents of PASE, because the war in Ukraine is linked to the situation in Belarus, and our fates of both our countries are interconnected. Help us in monitoring human rights abuses in Belarus. Sometimes we forget that atrocities, violence, tortures in our country are continuing. Every day, new detainees appear. Every day, NGOs are ruined. And recently, all the trade unions have been closed, and leadership of trade unions now are in jail. We have to speak loudly about this. And maybe it's all for now, but of course we have a lot of ideas how to collaborate closer. As I always say, non-conventional times need non-conventional decisions. And this steering committee is one of these unconventional decisions for us to be closer to you and for you to be closer to us. And thank you once again for this opportunity to speak here on behalf of free democratic people of our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sviatlana, for your remarks, and you have seen in the way our assembly reacted that the door is open here for you. Now I would like to ask Minister Haavisto to react on the things that he has identified in this rich debate. Pekka?
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for very insightful comments from the parliamentarians. And maybe my just first remark is that we are living in a Europe where the security system has really collapsed. We have created 1975 the Helsinki Final Act and all our organizations, OSCE and of course the Council of Europe, to prevent wars in Europe. And now we are living in a situation that we are in the middle of war. And this just comes so close to us when we, for example, think that whenever there could be peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, how the security guarantees for Ukraine could be organized. We are missing those mechanisms currently, reliable mechanisms. We had 2 Minsk agreements and these were not followed by Russia. And then who believes to the next agreements and who guarantees the security in the next agreements? These are very, very crucial questions. Then I would like to give my support to what Sviatlana proposed, the steering committee or similar mechanism in the Council of Europe for Belarus. I think it's extremely important to support the democratic Belarus and also the sovereignty of your country, because the sovereignty is under threat in these circumstances. My third comment is actually to Secretary General, your comment about the summit and the importance of the summit. Full support from our side to that. The colleague from Hungary asked about, it's of course more to do with the European Union, but it was about the European perspective of Ukraine and Moldova and the negative decision on Georgia. I'm really concerned, of course, that if our relations to Georgia is somehow weakened or our support to democracy and sovereignty of Georgia is not there, and I think we should really find mechanisms to support Georgia. I just met with the Speaker of the Parliament who visited Finland from Georgia and fully sharing your concern about that. Of course, we have to also understand that there has been some backlash in the democratic development of the country in the recent years, and this certainly affected to the Commission's recommendations. To the colleague from Turkey, you asked about the terrorism and terrorist movements. You asked a very timely question, because we have just yesterday spent with the Turkish delegation several hours in NATO headquarters, Finland and Sweden, discussing also these topics and so forth. Issues like negative decisions on PKK or PKK as terrorist listed, of course, is self-evident for all European countries. I understand that. But of course, it's important that we have a common definitions on what is terrorism in all countries, so that we can work together on these important issues. And I think this is an important debate. And then finally, I think Madam Sunna raised the issue of the human rights defenders. It's very close to my heart as well. And actually what we have been witnessing in whether it's Belarus situation or Afghanistan situation or Ukraine situation, that we are maybe lacking some mechanism in our system. We know the traditional migration, we know how to seek an asylum, but it's not always asylum that human rights defenders are asking. For example, those who are coming from Russia, they ask our support, but they want to keep also the possibility to return to their country in certain circumstances, and they need maybe our financial support and so forth. And particularly I'm concerned about the women human rights defenders and their role, and probably we should create some new support mechanism for particularly for these people. And thank you for the work that the Council of Europe has been doing for the human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. And I would like to ask our Secretary General for the closing remarks of this high-level panel. Madam Secretary General, it works.
It works, yeah. Okay. Well, as I have more often possibility to address this audience, I will be very short, and we will talk also later on. One point of general remark is that from what we heard, and from what hasn't been said, but it's said in different occasions, one thing is for sure, we can never be complacent and sure that our democracy is perfect. So there is no such a thing as achieved forever peace, security, as we can unfortunately witness for our country, Ukraine. But one thing is for sure, that we all together, and each of us individually in our different capacities, should do everything in order to uphold human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And I insist collectively, that means within this forum, within the Council of Europe, and individually in different aspects. And one word to Sviatlana and to your concerns. Council of Europe is ready and will support Belarus democratic opposition and civil society, and the work has started, as I mentioned, and I look forward to finding the best way to do it, and I look forward also to meeting you in the afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary General. May I thank the keynote speakers for their contribution to this panel discussion. May I compliment the colleagues in the hemicycle for the disciplined involvement in this debate. This is not an end, but a beginning of a discussion. I think that was said. I appreciated it very much. We now have to close this panel, and we will be back at 3:30 here in the hemicycle to continue our program. Thank you very much.